Suzanne had climbed to the top section of the wall and was preparing to abseil down. The crowd enjoyed the spectacle and applauded loudly for the daredevils who fearlessly climbed the high wall. Suddenly, Suzanne heard a sound as if something snapped. This was the last sound she heard as she plummeted to the ground with a terrible, bone-chilling scream. The crowd scattered, witnessing her falling at a terrifying speed. Panic spread rapidly among the spectators, and the thrill-seekers in the audience rushed towards Suzanne, who now lay motionless on the ground. Some began capturing the gruesome scene with their mobile phones and cameras, footage that would later be found on YouTube. In Suzanne's case, despite an ambulance being present on the site to provide first aid, it was determined that she did not survive the fall. Her body was later transported by hearse to the Bosch hospital for the required autopsy. The police conducted inquiries and ultimately concluded that it was a terrible accident. Nothing unusual was found on the confiscated cameras. Peter, who had witnessed the accident and immediately realized the hopeless situation, returned home in shock and immediately called Frank and the other guys to inform them of the tragic news. The funeral proceeded quietly. A notable absence was Stephen, who excused himself, claiming he had an important business meeting with a very loyal foreign client of his firm, and his boss insisted that he preside over this important meeting. He said he was sorry, but that Suzanne would never leave his memory, and he preferred to visit her grave privately without onlookers. He said he had lost her, but could find her again in peace at her grave. After that, he burst into tears. It was not spoken of again, and what's done is done. It was a beautiful funeral. Her grave was adorned with flowers, and her father had planted 2 rose hedges.
Peter, notably silent the past week, stood smoking a cigarette with Frank after the evening focus meeting, engaging in a conversation. The discussion didn't revolve around Suzanne. There had been enough talk about her in the past few days, and letting things rest for a while seemed wise. Instead, they talked about something both men had noticed on the internet, something that almost everyone in the Netherlands was now talking about, with a few foreign media outlets starting to take notice. What was going on? Recently, videos of the Next Genesis project had been appearing on the internet with a very strange message. The message proclaimed that they had the solution for world peace and were willing to go to great lengths to spread their idea. They believed it was time for the true mass murderers to be put behind bars. They called on everyone to examine the true rights of humanity and to let each individual decide who is harming them, urging them to arrest and convict their leaders. This sentiment was supported by a large portion of the population, as it became increasingly clear that they had surrendered their freedoms and were being monitored and controlled like animals. The number of cameras had become overwhelming, and the number of RFID chips produced already exceeded the number of grains of sand on Earth. Employers of companies with classified work mandated that their employees be chipped for safety and to monitor incoming and outgoing personnel. Everyone and everything was chipped and monitored in a vast computer system, akin to a large concentration camp with different barracks target groups. A herd of cattle held together by mass psychology, treated as such. Next Genesis claimed to have deciphered the source code and wanted to make it known to advance humanity's evolution. If this was the same organization as the Next Genesis Foundation, Frank found the idea not strange at all, because everything they had done so far had not harmed people and had only benefited them. The source code had piqued their interest, especially if it was the same code as in Eindhoven. There, it involved a Philips worker, Jan Sloot, who had developed a revolutionary code that could compress endless amounts of data. Philips, interested in this invention, wanted to test the system to see how it worked, as it could earn them billions. However, Sloot refused and wanted to be paid for his invention first. Philips agreed to a price of 10 million guilders and set the transfer date with the man in Eindhoven. However, the day before the appointment, Jan Sloot was found dead, and everything he had at home, in terms of materials and drawings, disappeared in one fell swoop. Sloot's son claimed his father had been murdered. His death was never solved, and the code was never found again. If that code could be used for multiple purposes, such as obtaining secret information, it could be something some governments were waiting for. And if it fell into the wrong hands, it could be an extremely dangerous weapon. However, the Next Genesis group went even further, stating that they now had a follower base of 15 million people worldwide who think the same and demand the same. Additionally, they were willing to sacrifice their eldest daughter every week live on YouTube to show that when some people believe in such rituals, it indicates complete madness. That sacrificing children to appease your God and make you believe that you become a better person or are favored is ludicrous. By sacrificing their eldest daughter, they indicate that women are the life bringers, and if they were to become extinct, the race is doomed to extinction. Man, woman, child are all equal according to human rights and the Foundation's beliefs. The self-sacrifice, as they call it, takes place every Sunday afternoon somewhere in the world live. And if the world wants to stop it, they must start by bringing the current world leaders, bankers, businessmen, and elite to justice. Meanwhile, the market project was running at full speed, and everyone was enthusiastic.
Roland hadn't been idle either and arrived on time for his appointment with Wendy at Praxis. She got into Roland's car, fastened her seatbelt, and introduced herself. She looked good, blonde, with a considerable figure. Before she got in, he had caught a glimpse of a delightful backside in tight jeans, paired with a dark blue top, altogether a feast for the eyes. He started the car and began telling her about himself right away. She nodded understandingly because she remembered him well, and she wouldn't easily forget the look in his eyes from that day. Luckily, he looked a bit more composed now. That would make conversation easier. He wasn't bad-looking, she thought quietly. He asked her if she had gotten her photos and/or camera back. She sat up straight and said, "Do you know why I find it so strange that you're bringing this up now? I did get a camera back, but it wasn't mine. I had a Canon digital camera, and they gave me a Pentax instead. The funny thing was, there were photos of the market on it, but they weren't the ones I took. These were taken earlier, half an hour earlier. I recognized the woman who was later arrested. She wasn't at the town hall yet in these photos. She was still on the other side of the street. I saw her crossing after this photo must have been taken, and it gave me a weird feeling because she kept looking around nervously. Thankfully, it ended well. I didn't really worry about the photos. The new camera apparently has more pixels and capabilities than my old one. Since I still have the dreadful sight after that attack burned into my mind, I don't need to see any more photos of it. I let the matter rest and tried to pick up my life again, and now I'm getting music therapy to help process things a bit better." "Very interesting," says Roland, who seems very interested. "So, I don't think I'll make you happy by telling you that I don't have that photo of a Moroccan man anymore. I have to admit, sometimes I'm glad not to see images for once, and that some things are starting to fade. I'm sorry, I can't help you." Roland was disappointed by this setback, and said he understood, though he found it unfortunate. He said that if he hadn't been in Iraq, he would never have dared to report on this attack, and probably would have wet his pants in a corner. It was okay. Admitting to fear kept you sharp, he told her. The conversation briefly touched on her work and the weather. As he stops the car in front of her parents' house, something suddenly crosses his mind. "Could I still have the photos from that day?" he asks unexpectedly. "There's nothing about the attack on there, just some shopping and waiting people," she replies. "Doesn't matter. It's just useful for reconstructing that particular day and what I still remember, because the subconscious often registers more than what one perceives with their eyes at that moment." She gets out of the car and rushes inside to get the camera, ignoring her mother, who had meanwhile opened the door for her. He starts the car again and sees in his mirror Wendy explaining to her mother what all this was about. Just before driving off, he said he would keep her informed and gave her his phone number, which she could call anytime if she wanted to talk. He drove home, loaded the photos onto his PC, and leisurely began enlarging them with the viewer. He wanted to know if he recognized anything or anyone in the crowd, which could shed a different light on the case. But what should he look for? This had occupied him for several days already, and to be honest, he hadn't gotten any wiser from his search. It was, as said, a crowd of shopping and waiting people.
Later that afternoon, Frank was sitting behind his computer when he suddenly saw a strange message scrolling across his screen. The message read as follows: "Due to the heightened terror status at this time, we, the government, are obliged to place a number of providers and servers under state supervision and will close various sites." Article 327 of the Criminal Code and Article 6666 of the National Constitution regarding Decision Code Red, enforcement and necessary order maintenance in public domains, including train stations, radio, television channels, and internet enterprises. Page 16, line 25. The government has the right at all times to place public domains and assets under state supervision in the interest of national security. We rely on your understanding and ask for God's help in these gloomy times. J.P. Balkenende. Fuck, thought Frank. Now it's really getting difficult. After the message stated that one could simply continue browsing the internet after reading it, Frank clicked on the website of the Brabants Dagblad to see what they had to say about it, and immediately wondered what the consequences of this would be for his program, knowing that he had an explosive piece of information in his hands. They reported the news indignantly, but the reaction of the citizens was that they could understand this, and they had heard enough about foreign bomb and weapon manufacturing sites, and that it was time for political intervention. The gambling and sex sites were still accessible, which reassured the entire population. Their toys were not affected. Various sites and forums, such as Above Top Secret, the sites of David Icke and Alex Jones with Infowars.com, and the Dutch site Nibiru, had disappeared from the scene. Writer sites and various forums where people discussed the future of the Netherlands were banned. Freedom of the press was, so to speak, silenced, and this was supported by a group of high-ranking and influential people who wanted to return to a 1950s Cold War politics, coupled this time with a kind of fake freedom, where you first have to have a lot of money to buy your real freedom. How you get that money is of no concern to them, and every criminal is treated like a king because of his amount of money. Freedom of speech suddenly became an empty phrase, and Frank was starting to panic a bit, but he knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. He composed himself again. Time will tell.